Chapter 10 of the leadership textbook is centered around the concept of leadership and diversity. So the chapter opens up with defining what culture is. So the first thing is it involves communication patterns. Communication patterns are the verbal and nonverbal codes used to convey meanings in face-to-face encounters. It then talks about patterns of relationships, which are strongly influenced by the culture in which one was raised. And then also it goes into formal organizations, which is structure the activities of significant numbers of people. And then it also kind of talks about culture as a collective whole. And it goes into talk about collective wisdom of a culture specifically. And that is shaped by historical events such as immigration, invasions, wars, economic crises, legal decisions, legislative acts, and the decisions of prior leaders. And then it also wraps up with a quote by Lao Tzu, which was to lead the people, walk behind them. And I thought that was kind of cool just because it really kind of grasped the whole concept that you have to be together to kind of be a leader. One thing that I actually, reading the book that we're doing for our project, comes from Phil Jackson, and it was an old samurai quote. And it was kind of the concept of togetherness, especially within a culture. And it was one samurai had his three sons each break one arrow. And then he went on to have them try to break, which they broke easily. And then he had them try to break three arrows at a time. And they couldn't do it. And the moral of the story was that when you work together, you cannot be broken and cannot be defeated. And that kind of, I feel like, is one thing that I took away from that quote. I could be looking too far into that, but it is what it is. So next week it goes into high and low context cultures. So high context culture involves covert and implicit. The messages are internalized. There's much nonverbal coding. Also, reactions are reserved. There's distinct in-groups and out-groups. But then also there's strong interpersonal bonds with that. The commitment is also high when it comes to high context cultures. And then usually the time is open and flexible. And that's kind of one of the key things that kind of come from cultural norms too, especially that sense of time. We tend to keep a pretty strict time schedule, whereas other cultures, that's really not that big of a deal. So obviously low context cultures are fairly much the opposite, which are overt and explicit. Messages are plainly coded. Details are verbalized more often than not. Reactions are typically on the surface, but you're also flexible when it comes to in-groups and out-groups. People are more fragile when it comes to interpersonal bonds and communications. Commitment's typically low, but then also as time is highly organized. So the chapter then leads into program valued patterns, and the first thing that it talks about with that is power distance. So power distance is the larger the power distance between leaders and followers, the greater fear of disagreeing with the superior, and the closer the supervision of follower activities. It then also says that followers in high power distance countries expect managers to give directions and feel uncomfortable when asked to participate in decision making. In addition to this, coercive authoritarian leadership is more common in high power distance countries. Democratic leadership is more often than the norm in low power distance cultures. And then to wrap up power distance, it says that organizations operating in low power distant countries are centralized and distribute rewards more equally. Then the next thing that it talks about in this subcategory is individualism versus collectivism. So followers in individualistic societies generally respond well to material rewards that honor individual effort. Members of collective societies, on the other hand, expect mutual loyalty between organizational leaders and followers. And then to be accepted, new ideas in collectivist countries must come from the group as a whole rather than the individual. The next subcategory is masculinity and femininity. So females in masculine cultures or countries have a harder time emerging as leaders and are more likely to be segregated in a few specialized occupations. Decision makers in feminine cultures put a greater emphasis on intuition and consensus, where leaders in feminine societies are more likely to demonstrate an interpersonally oriented leadership style. And then on the other hand, though, members of masculine cultures are more motivated by achievement, recognition, and challenge. So this next thing that it goes into based off all this is uncertainty avoidance. And high uncertainty avoidance cultures give more weight to age and seniority when selecting leaders. It's kind of the more older you get, the wiser you get, and that's more valued there. Whereas organizational constituents in high uncertainty avoidance cultures prefer clear instructions, are more willing to follow orders, disapprove of competition between employees, and are more loyal than their low uncertainty avoidance counterparts. And then finally, to wrap up this whole section, was the long-term, short-term orientation. So leaders in long-term orientation cultures can expect greater sacrifice from followers on behalf of long-term goals. But then, on the other hand, leaders in short-term orientation societies are under greater pressure to demonstrate immediate process. So the next thing that it mentions is the Globe studies, and the things that came from that was assertiveness, performance orientation, humane orientation, charismatic and value-based leadership, team-oriented leadership, as well as participative leadership and humane-oriented leadership. And then it also goes off by defining cultural intelligence based off of that, which is the ability to function effectively in culturally diverse settings. And then the chapter then goes off to go more in depth about diversity, but it gives about the benefits of diversity as a whole, which includes cost savings, resource acquisition and utilization, keeping and gaining market share, better decision making, greater innovation, as well as higher performance. And then to finally wrap up this chapter, it talks about men and female leadership behavior. And it starts off by saying men are more likely to emerge as leaders in short-term groups and in task-oriented teams, whereas women are more likely to emerge as social leaders in small groups. It also says that male leaders tend to adopt to a more task-oriented style based on gender norms, whereas women adopt to a more participative or democratic leadership style. But then it also says that male and female leaders are rated equally effective across organizational and laboratory studies. And then to kind of wrap this whole thing up, it then goes on to say that females are slightly more likely to engage in transformational leadership behaviors. So that is Chapter 10 in a nutshell. I thought it was pretty interesting with talking about leadership and diversity. This was pretty kind of much of a refresher of some of the things that we learned in Com 315, which I took last semester, so it's still kind of fresh on the head, and it was kind of cool to see it kind of relate to actual business and kind of entrepreneur type stuff, whereas in that class it was just kind of more based on the cultures. It did talk about some business aspects, but it was cool to see the text actually apply leadership into what it actually is like in the actual world. So that was it.